my name is Katie. I'm a doctorate student at the University of Maryland, and I work in a pollination ecology lab there, and I'm on the MOFA board of directors. And Cleo invited me to give you a little spiel on pollinators. And so I'm gonna try to keep my talk within 10 minutes and touch on some pollinator facts. You know, we hear all the time that pollinators are in decline, and towards the end of the talk, I'm gonna try to give a little bit of advice on how to conserve, especially our native and wild bee populations. So I'm just gonna start off really broad, and what is pollination? You know, we hear it all the time, but what is it? So it's pretty much a form of plant reproduction in which your anthers, the male part of your flower, that pollen gets transferred to the female part of the flower, which is the stigma. And the ovary then gets fertilized and you get seeds. It produces seeds. And I mean, this can happen within the same flower, which is self-pollination, like in tomatoes are self-pollinated, although you need bees to kind of loosen that pollen up. Or they can happen between flowers, what is cross-pollination. And actually, the majority of your flowering plants require cross-pollination in order to produce viable seeds. So I mean, how does that pollen make it from one flower to another? It's transferred via water, wind, for example, your conifer trees and your wheat, and actually animal pollination, which is biotic pollination, is the pretty much makes up the vast majority of how plants are pollinated. So I mean, I don't want to say bugs rule our world. I'm an entomologist. I'm a little biased, but the bugs kind of rule our world. I mean, so angiosperms, they're pretty much these flowering plants. They make up 1 out of every 6 species on this planet. I mean, they're everywhere. They're super common, and pretty much anywhere from 75 to 95% of these flowering plants, they require some form of biotic pollination. And that can be in the form of small mammals, bats, birds. That's a little more common in the tropics. But like I said, the vast majority of our pollinators are insects, and that ranges from wasps, bees, beetles. The most efficient pollinator are bees, and I will get into why they're considered the most efficient pollinator later on in the talk. But pretty much, you know, our food system is based on these flowering plants. And for example, the water, the plants that are in our water that help filter our water and keep it clean, like the poppy plants, and I think the water lily and such, those are flowering plants, and those are actually pollinated by a beetle. So I say bees are the most efficient, but the beetles are really important for pollinating these plants that are in the water. And you know, it's not just in our natural ecosystems, but agriculture. They're really important for agriculture. So there's about over 1,200 crops or so, and they're reliant on some kind of biotic transfer of pollen, some kind of biotic form of pollination. And probably among those 1,200 crops, 70 or so percent are pollinated by bees. There's about 10% in there that are pollinated by flies, and probably less than 5% or so are pollinated by lepidoptera, small mammals, beetles, wasps. And even though bees obviously make up the vast majority of our pollination, flies are really important. There's little syrphid flies, flower flies, and they often get mistaken for bees because they're black and yellow, and they're pretty big sometimes. You see them in the flowers. But you know, they're really important for strawberry pollination. There was a study out in North Carolina, and between our tiny little green sweat bees and the syrphid flies, that made up like the vast majority of pollinators to strawberries. You know, it wasn't the honeybee necessarily. And so these flies are really important. There's really cool research going on in Europe and Illinois about migrating syrphid flies and their contribution to some of our angiosperms, our flowering plants. So we don't know a lot about that, but hopefully in the future I'll be able to share with you more information about that. It's a pretty cool system. But okay, so I mean, depending on your latitudes will depend on what the most common flower visitor is. Okay, is temperate regions, probably your Hymenoptera, which are your wasps, your ants, your bees are the most common visitors we have to flowers. And as you go higher latitudes, actually flies are your predominant flower visitor. And then as you go back down into the tropics, you have your vertebrates, you have your birds, you have your bats, you get a little more vertebrate pollination. But I mean, there's, you know, the type of bees, and I have a little box here y'all can look at. The type of bees that pollinate our flowers are pretty much as diverse as the flower themselves, and we have to be careful because the top comes off. We can pass this around, or you can come look, but I mean, our bees come in all shapes, all sizes. We can, like I said, just be careful because the top, it's not taped. we can pass it around. But I mean, the bees are as tiny as a grain of rice, and they're as big as a bumblebee. Some of the queens are massive, the size of your thumb. But you know, all these bees, they're all different shapes, they're all different sizes, and you have specialist and you have generalist bees. And the majority of bees you see flying around are probably generalists, like your honeybee is a generalist, your bumblebee are generalist species. But you have quite a few of your pollinators, actually, your bees are specialists. And specialists is when they can only go to one kind of type of flower. And an example of that is your squash bee, your Pepinephis prunosa. They only pollinate cucurbits. Another example is your azalea bee, which is the Andrena, I think it's the Andrena cornelii. It only pollinates rhododendrons, okay? And that's a very specialized pollinator. Your blueberry bee only goes to Vaccinium, and that's a really efficient pollinator of blueberries, and that's an important pollinator along the east coast of blueberry farmers and such. So you have all these specialist bees, and so what makes, I mean, along with these specialist bees, there's a really cool website. It's by Sam Droege and Fowler, who's like Sam Droge's the bee taxonomy expert he lives in Maryland, but he's internationally renowned for his taxonomic expert in bees. And they put a website together, and on that website, pretty much the most common flower host to all these specialist bees is the asters. That hosts the most number of bees that are specialist pollinators, and then close behind them is the native sunflower, the salix, which is a shrub and it's a tree, and so that's kind of interesting how important our tree species are to these pollinators. Goldenrod is in there, and it's interesting. The Vaccinium, which are your blueberries, your cranberries, and such, are in there, and those are all native to the East Coast. And it's just interesting the diversity in these flowers. They bloom at different times of the year. I mean, they're trees, and they're so important to our not only generalists but our specialist pollinators. And in Maryland, in the Northeast, about 25% of our bees are specialists. So 100 bees in Maryland are specialists. There's 400 bees, native bees to Maryland, and 100 of those are specialists. In the United States, there's 4,000 native bee species, with a couple hundred introduced non-native bee species. You know, and the honeybee is just one of those. And just back to trees, a lot of our spring bees, they emerge in the early spring. They're only alive for about 3 weeks and then they die. And their whole diet, there's a really cool study that was published recently, their whole diet is reliant on pollen from trees. And I think we all forget that trees produce flowers and pollen, because they're so high up in the sky we don't see them. And so that was a fun study to read about. So it's not just planting flowers to help our pollinators, but planting trees as well. And so I'm going to jump a little bit. And why are bees so efficient? Why do they get so much attention? Why are they so efficient at pollinating? And I mean, one reason is that they're the only species pretty much in the world that are obligate flower visitors during both their adult and larval stage. So you have these female bees. They're out there collecting pollen and nectar, not only for themselves but for the larvae, for their eggs and larvae, so that they can develop. So they're busy. They're very busy bees. They if you watch a bee in a cluster of flowers, they're just constantly flying from flower to flower to flower to collect. And so they're in theory have to be very efficient to collect all this food for themselves and their young. Their cognitive abilities is pretty impressive. I mean, granted, we haven't really studied the cognitive abilities of wasps, so it's not that they're smarter. I'll talk about wasps and figs in a second. But they have to not only go back to their nest, drop off their pollen and nectar that they've collected, but they have to go back out and they have to remember where their food sources are. They can't waste so much time trying to look for more food sources. They kind of somehow memorize where those flowers are, where that food source is, and they have to continuously go back and to that same location. And there's some cool research on bee brains right now. I don't know much about that, but I know it's pretty interesting research. And they're hairy. If you look at the bees that I passed around, I mean, they're pretty hairy, especially the bumblebees. I mean, they're covered in hair. And the hair is actually electrostatic, so it attracts pollen to it. And if you think about that, if you look at a beetle that's super shiny, again, beetles are pollinators, but super shiny beetle, a super shiny wasp, they're not hairy, so the pollen doesn't stick to them as much. So they just tend to not be as efficient. So when we say bees, most people think of honeybees. And what we know about honeybees does not pertain to solitary and our native, pretty much does not pertain to our native and wild bees. They're very different. The honeybee is in, at least in North America, it's not native, it's domesticated. You have a queen, you have several thousand workers. The colony overwinters as a whole. Okay, this queen and a bunch of workers overwinter, and they're pretty big. If you've seen bee colonies, they're huge, and they nest in cavities in wild trees. And jumping to our native pollinators, 90% of our native pollinators are solitary. They live alone. They have one female, she raises her young, and that's it. There's one bee in the colony pretty much. And then she usually dies, and then next year that egg will develop into a larva. It will eat the pollen patty that she puts in there, and it will emerge next year. So 90% are solitary, and 70% of those bees nest underground, actually. And they build these intricate tunnels. Some of them are like 2 feet deep under the ground. They're typically in sunny areas, especially your spring bees. And at the tip of that, they lay their egg, they put their pollen patty in there, and then a couple weeks later, they die. And then that bee will emerge out of the ground next year. So it's pretty neat. Now that leaves 30% of our native bees are cavity dwellers. So you have your carpenter bees, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, that drill holes in our houses and decks. But they're important pollinators. And then we have our Osmia, our megachilidae, so our Osmia and our leafcutter bees. And they will nest in twigs, they'll nest in snail shells, anything kind of that's empty. They'll nest in empty carpenter bee nests. So they're cavity dwellers, but they don't excavate their own nests. And actually your leafcutter bees the alfalfa leafcutter bees, that particular species is not native, but it's really commonly used in alfalfa. It's the predominant pollinator of alfalfa, and it can be managed to a certain degree. You have these big bee hotels, which I have here, these massive pieces of wood that are brought out to these alfalfa farms, and you have these alfalfa bees that they pretty much put out when the alfalfa's in bloom. They emerge, they pollinate, and then they go back into hibernation mode after they're done pollinating. The Osmia actually are really important pollinators are apples. So actually it's not really our honeybee, it's our Osmia bees. And some of those are non-native, they're from Asia and Europe, but they're really efficient apple pollinators. So, I mean, what can we do to conserve some of our native pollinators? I mean, we know what?
Plant buckwheat.
Buckwheat is...
Buckwheat. We put buckwheat in a nice sized patch, and we had a horde of pollinators came out of nowhere. We didn't even know they exist there. And you do a little more research, you find out prior to 1920, buckwheat was the predominant grain grown on this continent before big ag came in with heavy industry and wheat.
Did not know.
So for hundreds of years, we were supporting pollinators that took care of buckwheat, and all of a sudden we pulled the rug out from underneath them, but they're still there.
That's pretty cool. Yeah. So what can we do to conserve these? We can plant pollinator gardens, and not just any kind of pollinator gardens native. It really helps to plant that native flora in there, because a lot of our bee, the 4,000 bees we have in North America, the 400 we have in Maryland, I mean, they've millions of years they've co-evolved with the flowers that we have that are native to this continent. And so it's really important to support those, to conserve those. We plant some native fauna, and not just plants, but trees. And like I said earlier, trees are actually surprisingly really important to spring bees' diets and such. And not only that, but they're pretty, they provide shade, and they also provide a lot of resources for our birds. The Lepidoptera love oak trees, and that supports a lot of our native and migratory bird populations that come through. And I mean, there's lots of other practices. For example, pesticide use, decreasing and not using chemicals and pesticide use, because the pesticide use, obviously, if you spray it on an insect and a bee, it's going to die probably. But the problem is people spray in homeowners. This goes for just homeowners and not just farmers. But you spray all your weeds, you spray your lawn, and that kills all our flowers that our bees rely on for food. You know, and not buying treated seeds is a big. And so just if you're a farmer, not buying them, or if you're a consumer, just supporting local farmers who practice organic management, who don't use treated seeds. Because what happens with the treated seeds, they did some fun studies, it's with honeybees, but the treated seeds, when the honeybees went to collect the pollen and nectar, it actually had it affected their cognitive ability to remember where these food sources were. So it had some deleterious effect on the bee's cognitive ability. So it's scary what some of these treated seeds, these pesticides, these neonicotinoids can do.
When you say treated seeds, you mean like grass seed, or what kind of seeds?
Corn, soybean,
Even sunflower seeds. True.
Yeah,
like
sunflower seeds.
A lot of people plant sunflowers. I'm like, you're using treated seed. It's a trap, you know.
Yeah.
What does treated seed mean, though?
A seed it's treated in, for example, a neonicotinoid chemical, and what it does is as the seed grows, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it grows and it has some pest resistant properties to it. It's a chemical, so it kills a lot of the pests.
So the chemicals, the plant takes that treatment up throughout the
Yeah.
plant. So any part of the plant that's eaten, whatever bug is eating the plant, can get neonicotinoids. And worse, or just as bad, they're also highly water soluble, which and so they leave the treated seed area and flow into the buffer strips that folks like us plant, and actually are found in the wildflowers in the buffer strips. So treated seeds really bad news.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, then what's the percentage of seeds that are actually treated? It's very high.
Oh, it's on the Delmarva Peninsula. Other than the farms that we farm, and I can name like 5 other grain farmers, they're all treated.
Yeah.
I mean, the Delmarva's awash in neonics.
and it's actually hard to find untreated seeds. You
Special
have to order
order.
them in advance. They can be very tricky to
And
find.
for instance, and it's very hard for you to find out whether they're
Yeah.
treated.
They don't like to
and I
tell
can
you.
tell you from experience, I read that 75% of sunflower seeds, now,
Yeah.
to
Right.
plant sunflowers for bees, yeah, 75% of sunflower seeds sold in the U.S., or I think it's 80%, are treated with neonicotinoids, which is so powerful they grow up to the whole part, the nectar, the pollen. And I even called this particular sunflower seed and talked to this company, the seed company, talked to the sunflower seed expert for an hour. And he could only disclose what antifungal treatment
Yeah.
they applied to it after they got the seed from the farm that they contracted to grow it. He knew it was something, it had some prior treatment, but he didn't even know what it was. So you can't even figure out what's on it.
So-
The only way to know it's
Yeah.
not treated with neonics is to buy organic.
So we have found, if anybody's interested, talk to me. We have found a couple dealers that we have to order it usually in October. Even Pioneer, well-known seed companies, if you get them early enough to have the right people, you can get untreated seed. But it takes some doing, so give us a shout and we can get you untreated seed.
Chesapeake Wildlife Heritage.
Ask a question. So, say you bought your seed packet, you planted your seeds, you harvested seeds off of the plant. Does it go into the next generation, or
It can go to adjacent fields and it can go to successive crops. They have shown that it can go to successive crops.
so that same?
Yeah, the seeds. Those seeds can be affected, I think, by it.
Some residual. It'd be greatly reduced, I would say, but
Yeah.
the seeds is,
Yeah.
there's
How
still
about
to be.
the bird seed that you buy from wild birds and all?
Don't even get everybody started on how sunflowers are grown commercially in the Midwest. I mean, that's a whole, we don't have time, but it's awful.
Yeah.
They're all treated,
So if you're buying seeds from
The seeds you're buying are treated.
a gardener or a small grower, what you want to do is get them from a seed company that has a safe seed promise. Somebody like Fedco, Johnny's. There are a lot of them out there. A lot of small ones. Baker Creek grows only heirlooms. There's High Mowing Seeds. They all have that, and you all may know this. So sorry, I don't mean to be redundant, but as a gardener or a smaller grower and not growing a field of sunflowers, that's where you want to look for untreated seeds.
And this is the sad part about it is our honeybees are pretty much produced throughout the South. They're domesticated here in the United States. And so if they die, which they tend to, high rate of death, you just replace them. And your native populations, you can't do that.
Right.
And so they're being affected by all these adverse effects. So 80% of the land in the United States is owned privately. And so it's up to us to do something.
Yeah.
We can't wait for the government because they don't own most
Yeah.
of the land.
Yeah.
And so just by being a little more conscious of what's around us, and honeybees, just to throw a shout out for native pollinators, they're already doing a lot of our pollination services with a lot of our crops, our blueberries, our pumpkins, our squash, our strawberries. I mean, honeybees they're not very efficient pollinators of that, and sometimes you don't even see a lot of honeybees on those crops. So it's really kind of up to us. And I mean, I brought this little bee box here. Providing housing, so land and loss of habitat's a big problem. Loss of floral resources. This is for like your little leaf cutter and mason bees, and you can just buy them. I recommend buying higher quality because if you buy a cheap one off Amazon, it falls apart. Plus, it's nice to support your local
So where did you
local
get this?
people. This is from a friend.
Okay.
I bought, but if you're interested, I can send you links and such. But the little bees come in here and they nest, and you just kind of put it up on your tree, and it's a way to just provide some habitat. So I'll let you guys ask questions, but I want to leave y'all with a little quote from one of my favorite biologists. Okay, so quote, "It's the little things that rule the world," end quote. So that's why we have to protect our bugs, y'all.
And who's the person?
Wilson, E.O. Wilson.